you. And we'll start our clock as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and you are good to go. Great.
Well, good morning. My name is Kaylee Cunningham,
My name is Will Furlow.
And I'm Katrina Madura.
and we are Bluestone Consulting. We are a consulting group that has backgrounds in a variety of different areas, including but not limited to marketing, sales, management, philosophy, as well as ethical reasoning. Our goal is to provide exceptional, comprehensive, and ethically based consulting services. We tend to service companies who are seeking business solutions driven by an unvarnished and unbiased opinion of their business's overall perception in domestic and international markets alike. With that being said, we've constructed our presentation today with the intention of addressing you, the board of directors of the pharmaceutical giant Viera. The driving purpose behind this presentation is to tackle the board's questions about their drug Daraprim. Some of these questions include concerns about its pricing, as well as its effect on Viera's overall corporate image. We've conducted an analysis of the situation with a focus on perceptions at the consumer, shareholder, as well as public policymaker levels. As directed for our study, we've used only publicly available information from sources available to all consumers.
To summarize our presentation process, we will first begin with a review of Viera Pharmaceuticals, as well as a history of their drug Daraprim, and what led to Viera's present situation. Subsequently, we intend to ethically analyze Viera's business practices from the eyes of its stakeholders, the practices which led to Viera's current valence in the domestic and international markets. We will then move on to present and discuss the legal implications for Viera and other pharmaceutical companies practicing similar pricing and business models. Afterwards, we will support our previous analyses with financial benchmarking studies that compare Viera's Daraprim pricing with congruent drugs. Finally, we intend to provide pricing recommendations based on our three-pronged analysis, and afterwards, we will field any and all questions from the board.
So, to begin with, I will start off with a brief review of the evolution of the company Viera as a whole. Viera Pharmaceuticals, formerly known as Touring Pharmaceuticals, was actually founded and run by the infamous American businessman Martin Shkreli. Historically, Viera Pharmaceuticals actually had a relatively neutral valence surrounding itself in the global market, and it was a fairly well-regarded company. They were and still are known for a multitude of medications, including a variety of class 4 drugs. The requirements for being labeled as such are medications, low probability of being abused, and also its typical propensity for life-saving care. One of these class 4 drugs that Viera manufactures is known as Daraprim. Daraprim, whose chemical name is pyrimethamine, was originally manufactured in the 1950s as a malaria treatment. However, as of late, it has also been used to treat other medical conditions. Because Daraprim is an antifungal drug, it has been discovered that it can also be effective at treating a parasitic condition called toxoplasmosis. This disease is something that's found in pregnant women, infants, as well as those individuals with HIV and AIDS. Despite the fact that the parasite causing toxoplasmosis can actually be found in almost every living human being, the only individuals who actually contract this disease are those who are immunocompromised. In other words, this condition is ravaging some of the most vulnerable sects of our population. Individuals who are pregnant do not have the immunocapacity to fight off this parasite due to the immensely taxing physical stress of creating a new life. Similarly, if infants can't fight off this parasite simply because they haven't been alive for long enough to build up the kind of mature immune system that's required for taking on this kind of internal battle. Lastly, those with HIV and AIDS are already living their daily lives at a much higher risk of complications associated with very everyday medical occurrences, such as the flu, the cold, and pneumonia. The possibility of contracting toxoplasmosis just adds another straw to the camel's back, so to speak, to their already incredibly compromised immune systems. These individuals, our mothers, our sisters, and our daughters, our precious newest family members whose lives have just begun, and also those who we love and support with HIV and AIDS, they are the ones who depend on Daraprim. And now they are the ones who are being exploited. Prior to 2015, a single pill of Daraprim cost around $13 for the patient. As a result of a direct order from Martin Shkreli, the price of a single Daraprim pill has now raised to $750. When a typical toxoplasmosis treatment can require a patient to take 3 Daraprim pills from anywhere from 8 weeks to the rest of their lives, we can start to see the formation of an ethical dilemma here. Despite being fully aware of the incredibly vulnerable population of which she was servicing, Martin Shkreli decided to increase the price of Daraprim by 5,000%. And since then, not only the Shkreli name, but also Viera Pharmaceuticals as a whole has become synonymous with many unsavory terms, such as price gouging, defrauding, and ripping off, just to name a few. Unfortunately, despite Mr. Shkreli's recent incarceration, the public perception of Viera in 2018 is still incredibly damaged. Viera's previously untarnished reputation has taken a huge hit in the eyes of the consumer due to the money-motivated decision-making of their founder and former CEO. Obviously, the purpose of a business is to make a profit and grow the intrinsic value of the firm, thus boosting shareholder value. However, we are here today to suggest that perhaps it's time to take a look at a price that's fair for everyone involved, and that has an outcome that we can all be proud of. At this point in time, Daraprim still remains at an astronomical price of $750 per pill. And it's time that we realized, for Daraprim, the price most certainly is not right.
Before we look at the legal and financial aspects of this discord, we will discuss the ethical considerations important for determining a solution to this case. We used an ethical framework called the 8 key questions to get a comprehensive view. We believe the 8 key questions to be universal and vital human values that help prompt us for critical thinking about all ethical considerations involved. The first question we discussed was fairness, and the most pressing issue that we discussed was the accessibility of the drug. More specifically, how limiting the accessibility of this drug by such egregious price increases is unfair to our most vulnerable population. We believe that a fair price would allow consumers to still purchase this drug while allowing the producers of this drug to recoup costs for production and development.
When analyzing the potential outcomes of the scenario, we tended to look at it from both short and long-term perspectives. From the short-term perspective, the outcome of lowering the price of Daraprim would honestly more than likely temporarily reduce profits for the company and may actually result in minor backlash from the shareholders. However, it would also enable more people to be able to purchase the drug. With an increased ability to obtain Daraprim, realistically, more lives are going to be saved, and that would greatly mitigate some of Viera's recent bad publicity. From a long-term perspective, the outcome of lowering the price would be the previously mentioned good publicity. This would more than likely have a positive, tangible financial effect for the company. With an increased consumer base, they would more than likely be able to grow their profit margins to the point that they were prior to reducing the price of Daraprim. As a society, most of us tend to be locked into concern for only our personal outcomes. However, when you're controlling something with life-saving capabilities, the need to expand your decision-making for what happens in the future and those outside of your immediate circle is extremely paramount.
The next question we discussed was responsibilities. We believe that you as board members have a responsibility to the people that use this drug to live healthy and productive lives. Additionally, the company as a whole has a duty to supply this drug to the people who need it, plain and simple. Lastly, we believe that the patients have a responsibility to their health, and they can't fulfill this responsibility due to the increasing cost of the medication through no fault of their own.
When analyzing character, we once again looked at it from 2 different perspectives. So our first perspective was the character of the company versus the character of the individuals making the decisions within the company. As we previously mentioned, it would be ideal for Viera to increase its positive publicity, and thus its character associated with the decision makers within the company itself. However, it is also important, in our opinion, for Viera to take on a business model with the triple bottom line in mind. The triple bottom line being people, planet, and profit. It is essential that Viera as a whole is seen as a good company, and a company with good moral character that is no longer exploiting vulnerable people around the globe simply for the sake of a profit. Once this is done, hopefully, Viera will be able to separate themselves from the negative stigma that is Martin Shkreli.
In discussing liberty, we believe it's important to notice that the board has the liberty to make pricing decisions as they see fit. However, making these decisions without considering the liberties of the effects on the consumer restrains the consumer's individual liberties. Additionally, since Viera is the only producer of this drug on the American market, you have eliminated the option for consumers to find a more affordable option, again, stifling the consumer's freedom and autonomy. We believe that requiring people to pay such high prices for a medication now might limit future financial decisions that these people and their families might need to make, another way of restricting consumers' liberties.
So empathy can really be analyzed from the perspective of both the end user, so the patients and their families who are involved in the situation, and also from the corporate perspective. We must keep in mind, like Katrina said, that the pricing of this life-altering drug directly affects the long-term financial liberties of the patients and their families. While reducing the price of Daraprim may temporarily decrease shareholder value, they're going to turn a profit regardless. And because of this, it's much, much easier to have empathy for the patients and their families who are involved in these situations, whose lives are forever altered due to the extreme financial burden of supporting a person on a Daraprim treatment. It is extremely important to include empathy, the emotional aspect of morality in decision-making, because without such a reminder of the humanistic aspect of situations, morality can quickly devolve into heartless calculation.
In discussing authority, we looked at both the legal and industry standards as a guide for Viera's current actions, which we will discuss further in this presentation. But more importantly, we consider you, as the board, an authority for Viera's business practices, and as a result, Viera's reputation depends on those actions.
So lastly, we decided to analyze the rights of the people involved versus the rights of the company itself. We as humans have an innate right to life, and going hand in hand with that right is our humanitarian right to access affordable health care. With that being said, we believe that Viera is effectively squashing their consumers' right to access affordable health care, and thus their right to life as well. These patients need Daraprim in order to maintain a certain quality of life and also just to prolong their lives in general. With Viera acting as a deterrent to obtaining this kind of life-saving and life-prolonging care, like I said earlier, they are effectively squashing the rights of their consumers. In times of crisis, there are legal rules against price gouging to protect vulnerable peoples from the tight hold that businesses have on their commodities. So why does this not apply to vulnerable patients in need of life-saving care? Well, we think that it should.
Thank you, Kaylee. Thank you, Katrina. Now we're going to take some time to discuss the legal implications of Viera's new distribution scheme and the foreboding legal environment that they're likely to encounter in the near future. Daraprim used to be extremely easy to access when they used a traditional distribution system. As you can see from here, hospitals and pharmacies were able to access the drug from multiple wholesalers, and consumers and patients were able to just take their prescription to the local pharmacy and get it filled. That's how easy it was. Recently, however, Viera implemented a system in which Daraprim was controlled solely through a new program called Daraprim Direct. In order to access this drug, individuals and institutions had to set up accounts directly with Viera, and they also had to wait for approval just to start receiving the drug. Now, hospitals and consumers have to jump through multiple hoops just to access this life-saving drug, and it kind of makes you wonder, if a company owns a life-saving drug, don't they have a responsibility to those who need the drug to make it easily accessible to them? With this new distribution system, the perception is that Viera is demonstrating monopoly-like tendencies because of how they exert total control over the supply chain and how they intentionally block out competitors. John Haas, the director of patient access at Viera, was even quoted saying, "I would block the purchase if a generic drug maker would try to order the pill. We like to do our best to avoid generic competition. Generic companies always seem to figure out a way to make the pill, but we're certainly not going to make it easier for them." Now, this type of exclusionary behavior is a clear violation of the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984, which was written with the purpose of encouraging the generic drug market, along with increasing competition and driving down prices amongst pharmaceutical companies. In order for these generic drug companies to typically be successful, they normally have to be able to purchase large quantities of the brand name drug. They need to do this so that they're able to perform research and development to ensure that their generic version is essentially the bioequivalent of the brand name. which on a basic level means that the drugs are able to do the exact same thing. But this research and development obviously isn't feasible under Bayer's current distribution system, which intentionally blocks out potential generic competitors. And this strategy is a clear disregard of the legal authorities at play. Bayer is currently at a crossroads. They can either implement a pricing and distribution approach that is consistent with current legal standards, or they can deal with the impending legislative ramifications. There are currently multiple bills under review in committees in both the Senate and House of Representatives regarding how pharmaceutical companies operate. The most pertinent of these is the Stop Price Gouging Act. The Stop Price Gouging Act is significant because if it were to be passed, it would impose heavy taxes and fines on pharmaceutical companies that make the decision to intentionally spike up the price of their drug. And the metric that they would use to kind of measure this would be the annual percentage increase in the medical care CPI. So if the average price for medical products and drugs increases a certain amount, and a pharmaceutical company spikes the price of their drug greater than that amount, then they would be subject to these fines. So, although this act hasn't quite yet been signed into action, the ball is rolling on legislation to fight monopolies in the pharmaceutical industry. And Bayer now has the opportunity to implement a proactive approach to their pricing and distribution practices before the law starts to catch up with them. This ties back into one of the key questions that was mentioned earlier, outcomes. What kind of outcomes does Bayer exactly hope to achieve in the long term? Do they forever want to be associated with the borderline illegal pricing practices of Martin Shkreli? Are they going to separate themselves from that and take a new step forward using ethical pricing and doing what's best for the consumer and the shareholders?
Now we will continue our analysis with a financial benchmarking process that we will walk you through. We began our financial research with Evaluate Pharma's 2017 drug report. We gathered data from a peer group benchmark companies. What this means is that these companies we are evaluating are similar in both size and patient number to Bayer. Using this publicly available information, we developed an ethical price point for Daraprim, which is based on industry averages. For peer group financial statements, we use annual revenue reports for orphan drugs. Orphan drugs are pharmaceuticals that are underdeveloped because of the limited potential for profit. Or in other words, there isn't a large enough market for certain drugs, and companies don't spend the time or money to produce them. Although Daraprim is not, in fact, an orphan drug, these are some of the most expensive comparable drugs on the market, and this is why we use it as a benchmarking tool because of Daraprim's egregious pricing.
So with approximately 8,000 patients in the US treated annually, Daraprim has average annual revenues of $126,000 per treated patient. Based on companies that we've benchmarked, we've actually determined that the revenue Bayer is currently generating off Daraprim is almost 100% above the industry average. However, these similar drugs that we've benchmarking, as Katrina referenced earlier, are orphan drugs and consistently some of the most expensive drugs on the market at any given time. So with that being said, it's absolutely inconceivable for Bayer to have these kinds of profit margins in comparison to their counterparts who are, in theory, supposedly selling more expensive drugs. Due to the fact that Bayer is actually a privately held company, little to no specific financial information was actually available. Taking this into consideration, we performed an ROI benchmarking analysis that consisted of public information relating to Bayer's peer group companies. Examples of information that we gleaned from peer group companies include ROIs, annual sales estimates, as well as revenue and return information. We then scaled these estimates with results based off of the publicly published estimates of Bayer's own annual sales revenues, as well as their number of patients.
As you can see from this graph, Daraprim's current price of $750 a pill gives them a price factor of 1.8. What this price factor of 1.8 means is that the price of Daraprim is on average 1.8 times greater than similar drugs that are sold to, that treat the same amount of patients. So, with an estimated cost to market that's 2.2% below the industry average, Bayer has fewer costs to recover in order to make a profit than their industry counterparts. With that being said, even at a pill per price of $398, not only will they still be able to turn a profit, but they'll actually be making more money than others in the industry still. With similar profit margins to competitors and fewer costs to recover, Viera is currently in very good financial standing in the marketplace.
As Will previously mentioned in the legal section, Viera has intentionally been barring competitors from obtaining large amounts of the brand name Daraprim in order to limit the ability to develop a generic form of this drug. They have historically done this by citing their main purpose as a business, which is to make money. However, what they tend to ignore is what actually happens to revenue and revenue margins when generic drugs hit the market. While prices do tend to decrease anywhere from 24 to 48%, depending on whether the drug is oral or an intravenous drug, what actually happens to profits is that they increase by at least 46% and sometimes all the way up to 57%. So in other words, there's no real financial reason for Viera to continue on with its monopolistic hold on Daraprim. As requested, we have provided the board with an analysis based off of the consumer perception surrounding Viera and their drug Daraprim, using only publicly available information. We have conducted a detailed ethical, legal, and financial analysis of the pricing discord that's associated with their drug Daraprim. And considering our findings, there is clear reason for the board to be concerned. However, we do not presume to make a firm pricing recommendation. Rather, we think pricing should be consistent with the board's short and long-term goals, which we know that we are not privy to. With that in mind, we would like to recommend that the best option is to move towards the price of $400 as illustrated in the financial benchmarking section earlier. This price is based not only on industry average benchmarking as we showed, but also would be a more ethically reasonable price.
In conclusion, we believe that you as board members have a responsibility to protect this vulnerable population from unfair and predatory pricing. In the interest of acting equitably, we believe there is a clear disadvantage that exists against those who depend on this drug to live, and that the ethical solution corrects for this disadvantage. The character of you individually and for the company that you represent depends on how you choose to act in this situation and when there are lives on the line. Can you go home today and look your families in the eyes, knowing that the decision you make may prevent someone from going home and looking their families in the eyes? We believe that the right to life here is paramount to the right to make money. To be clear, we want an outcome that is most ethical for the most amount of people, and we believe it's to lower the price.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we will field any and all of your questions that you have for us.
I want to ask you one question.
Yes, ma'am.
Many companies of our size and larger have extensive humanitarian programs. So if someone has insurance and the insurance is paying for the drug, why we could charge $750, but we could offer humanitarian programs for those who lack insurance and lack financial resources. That was not addressed at all in your presentation. So my question to you is, what makes that, why was that not considered as a solution? And if you did consider it, what was the ethical imperative that led you to the conclusion that your program, cutting the price in half, without mentioning the humanitarian end of it, was preferable?
And you're completely right. There is that humanitarian aspect involved with the insurance companies. However, based off of our research, we realized that not only do insurance companies not fully cover the cost of a Daraprim treatment, but for those who don't have insurance, let's say if they have some sort of financial stability, they will charge you full price for a Daraprim treatment up until the point that you declare bankruptcy. At which point, then they'll start giving you either lower priced options, or they won't charge you at all. So basically, if you have money, they'll charge you for the pill until you don't have money, and then they'll stop charging you.
When you say they, you're talking about us.
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. Does that answer your question?
So would you consider a solution short of someone declaring bankruptcy as being viable?
Personally, no, because as Katrina mentioned earlier, that affects the long-term financial liberties associated with patients and their families being able to live prosperous lives. After a treatment of Daraprim, of a few years, which could cost anywhere from $120,000 up to $800,000. That severely limits the patients and their families' financial ability to be able to move forward with their lives even after the treatment. With that kind of debt and with that kind of debt associated to themselves, it's very hard to progress forward.
Questions?
So, thank you for passing out the card and for a presentation focusing on business ethics. It's great that you removed the mystery and vagueness from it by giving us a framework like this. Is this framework, can you defend this framework from the standpoint of business ethics? Is it possible for a company like ours to let this framework help guide our decisions in a competitive, capitalistic marketplace?
So like I mentioned previously, I think that's a great question, but I do think that this framework are 8 human vital components. These are culturally diverse components, and so they are tested against all kinds of scenarios and cases. I don't think any one of these is excluded just because we're talking about business ethics. I don't think it would vary if we were talking about international ethics. Simply because of the broadness of the way that they are framed, we can apply them to any case or scenario. And I think they are especially relevant here. The way that we broke them down, I think we applied them to this case and made them especially relevant in the way Bayer is pricing their drug Daraprim.
When does Daraprim come on patent?
It's actually already been off patent. Yes, for about 40 years now.
40 years?
Yes.
So is there a risk of a generic?
With the way that they have the distribution system that Will was speaking about earlier, the Daraprim Direct system, they're keeping such a tight hold on their inventory of this drug, despite interest in creating a generic market. There physically is just not the ability at this point in time due to the way that Daraprim is currently being distributed.
But didn't the generic manufacturers have, close to 40 years of opportunity to build that generic before Daraprim Direct came into being?
They did, but initially this drug was sold for a lot less, and it's a drug used for such a specific disease that there wasn't as much interest initially. Now generic drug companies, they can look at this insane profit margin, and even if they were interested in it, they wouldn't financially be able to purchase enough to make their own generic version. So initially there wasn't the interest because there wasn't as much of a profit margin. Yeah.
That's fine. I have a question on the legal aspects of it. So, you're discussing the potential risk of fines due to price gouging and this type of behavior. Do we, as a company, do we have any risk for legal claims from patients or insurance companies? And if so, what does that risk look like?
Well, at this point, it's not, the legislature isn't stemming from a point of a consumer basis. It's more coming from a standpoint of monitoring the pharmaceutical companies and the pharmaceutical industry as a whole. So no, I don't think you're going to see any sort of lawsuits coming directly from patients. However, as Will said in the legal portion, with the impending legislature that's on the books right now under congressional review, it's very realistically possible that in the near future, your business model is not going to fit in the legality of the realm of pharmaceutical companies.
And have you looked at what that financial exposure might look like? I mean, are we talking a small percentage of our profits, or are we talking?
At this point, I don't believe that the actual figures, we have the actual figures. Will, are you?
Yeah, the bills were still under review. They didn't list specific amounts that the companies would be fined. They just gave the metric that if the price spike increased more than the consumer price index for the medical care sector, then that's when the fines would start being imposed.
So if we were to decrease the price, do you recommend that we also keep that distribution model so that we can stave off the risk of generics?
Personally, I think that yes, that is what we have been talking about. In order for you not to give up all of the control that you currently have over Daraprim and just kind of rock your pharmaceutical world, so to speak, to be able to hold on to some semblance of the distribution system that you have at hand would be reasonable from our perspective. But if that were the case, then we definitely think that a reduction in price would be necessary just to make it more accessible to those people who truly need it. Because if the Daraprim Direct system stays in effect, the likelihood of a generic equivalent emerging in the market is very low.
If I can't afford it at $750, what makes you believe that I can afford it at $398?
Just in comparison to the other, to consumers and patients who purchase similar drugs. We haven't seen the kind of public backlash from consumers and from the country as a whole in relation to drugs that cost $300 to $400, like we have seen with the extremely negative publicity that you all have had recently with the spike in the Daraprim cost.
But is it because of the raw cost of the drug, or is it because of the fact that Martin Shkreli had the chutzpah to go from $13.50 to $7.50? I mean, what was the driver of the negative publicity?
Right, and I think it's a little bit of both actually, because the actual raw materials and price of creating this drug, there are international companies that market this drug for anywhere from $1 to $5 a pill, but simply they don't have the production capabilities to be able to manufacture it on a large enough scale to supply it to the global population that truly needs it.
Can I buy it in Canada? And if so, at what price?
I'm not sure about Canada, but in Europe, I know that you can buy it from $1 to $5, but the FDA bars it being able to be brought into domestic markets.
In other words, it's cheaper for me to get on a plane to the EU and buy myself a year's supply of Daraprim
Yes.
and come back.
It is.
But they won't let you back in.
Well,
If you'd like to stay over there and continue the treatment, but yes, you're correct.
In your research, did you come across, well, first of all, is it your sense that we're the first company that employed this novel approach with distribution, Daraprim Direct?
Yes, that is our understanding. Most other drug companies tend to distribute in the traditional system distribution that we'll put up on the first slide, which consists of it being sent out to different wholesalers or distributors and then going down to the hospital and pharmacy level for the consumers, as opposed to releasing small quantities at a time only to licensed retailers.
Are you aware of any other pharmaceutical company that has followed us with creating a similar distribution system?
At this time, no, we are not. Viera seems to be the only one on the market that has this kind of stringent and strict distribution system.
Have representatives of the distribution communities or any other stakeholders sued us, or otherwise have they tried to legally challenge this novel approach to distribution?
I don't know about a lawsuit, but we, in our discovery, had talked about more push for that legislation for like the Stop Price Gouging Act to really be pushed through Congress because of Viera's actions. So, while maybe not a specific lawsuit, there might be more support for current legislation to be pushed through.
so we haven't had an AG or one of the U.S. attorneys go after us for restraint of trade? This is a classic form of restraint of trade. Or would you disagree with that statement?
I would agree with that statement, but at this,
So then ethically, as a board, you've just told us that we are in restraint of trade in violation of probably the Sherman Act and possibly the Clayton Act as
yes.
well.
Yes, that would be correct.
And you're encouraging us to remain in restraint of trade, but simply lower the price of the drug.
Well, at this point,
How is that ethically or legally sustainable?
Well, at this point, considering that there haven't been any lawsuits on the books that we've been able to find, obviously you all are skirting right within the legality limits. Whether or not that sits well with your conscience is something that the board will have to decide on their own as far as the distribution process. But so we can't necessarily convince you to change your entire distribution process, but from our perspective, if you were to maintain that one aspect of the integrity of your company or the distribution process that you have, if that's your paramount concern at this point, which is from our research, what we gleaned, it seems like the paramount concern is to make sure that generics don't hit the market, that you all maintain a certain level of control over Daraprim, then in that case, in order to increase the accessibility to the patients that need it, the only route that we saw at that point was for the price to be decreased.
My concern, from the point of view of a plaintiff's lawyer, you said that there were 8,000 patients a year. So this might not be right or lucrative enough to form a class action against us on behalf of the patients. My concern is the Justice Department. Are you not worried about the Justice Department because you don't think Jeff Sessions is going to go after a manufacturer? Or are you worried about an ambitious U.S. attorney or a attorney general bringing an antitrust action?
That is definitely a concern, but just judging, we obviously can't look into the future and see what's going to happen a few months or even a year from now, but just judging based off of historical records, since that hasn't been a problem yet, that's not what we made our main focus.
So I'm a little, as a board member, I'm a little concerned with, when if we were to take your recommendation and have the price, that business sector is going to have its profits, unless we're able to have some type of reduction in expenses, which the only thing that I can see, because we're not spending a lot of money on R&D, is cutting employee staff, which we always are hesitant to do. So do you have some type of idea or recommendation on ways that we can ethically and legally and financially make this change from a shareholder perspective?
Absolutely. At first glance, lowering the price of the drug may make it seem like there's going to be a big loss of shareholder value. But by lowering the price, we're going to be able to be more competitive on a global level. So, right now, the international companies that sell Daraprim and similar drugs, they don't have the manpower to manufacture enough drug. There's a huge demand, but not enough supply abroad. So if we were to lower our price, yes, we would be selling the drug for less in the U.S., but we would be able to be more competitive on an international level, and that would open up an entire new market, thereby creating more value for shareholders and kind of mitigating that financial loss that we would incur from lowering the price.
So do you recommend lowering the price and then setting up those distribution channels, or the vice versa?
I recommend lowering the price and setting up those distribution channels so that we're able to go broad.
So in other words, we're going to go abroad and we're going to gouge abroad too?
Well, that's why we want to make sure we lower the prices first.
You're saying that we're not in that market now, so we have to go over there where people are buying the drug, even though it's difficult to get for a very small amount of money. And who are we going to gouge the health insurance systems in Great Britain and in France and socialized medicine? What's to believe that those countries are going to engage with us and say, sure, we'll pay you $398. In Britain, they may say, we'll do a cost-benefit analysis and accept that some people will die. And that's how we choose to spread the risk. Why do you think that this is going to be successful?
I think that one possible solution to sell it for almost back to its original price instead of trying to market Daraprim directly internationally.
So you're saying it's okay to charge $13.50 overseas to build a market, but we're going to charge $398 in America? Is that what you just said?
It's
I think that's
Well, typically abroad, so like we mentioned earlier, Daraprim was initially engineered to be a malaria treatment drug. And obviously malaria is a much more prevalent issue in countries that are not as developed as the United States. And with that being said, the potential growth in the consumer population that's available overseas is much greater than it would be in the United States. And also they don't necessarily have the resources and technology to be able to develop that. So while we did recommend a $390 to $400 price range for Daraprim in the domestic market, that was based off of their peer group companies who are also within this domestic market. While there is a much broader consumer base abroad, we think that if we lower the price in the domestic market, that may open up doors for us to be able to branch out internationally and start servicing some of these clients, like foreign hospitals, other things of that nature that need this drug to be able to treat it not only for toxoplasmosis, so for the 8,000 or whatever patients who have toxoplasmosis, but also for their patients who are going to require a much shorter Daraprim treatment than a toxoplasmosis treatment typically would be, which could be anywhere from 8 weeks to the rest of your life. A malaria treatment is only about a week and a half long. So that's something that we could potentially branch out into if the prices were to come down.
Will your argument survive a shareholder driven in Boston? If our shareholders see that we have been able to be very profitable and proceed with a business plan at $750 for the pill, and they see our revenue go down by 40%, if we go to 398, will they sue us and will they win?
Well, you, as the board, you all asked us to analyze this from the consumer perspective, and so that's exactly what we've done here. And from the consumer perspective, it's better for the shareholders who are going to make a profit regardless due to the extremely low price it actually takes to manufacture Daraprim, and also due to the fact that you all don't have to do any more research and development. We believe that price, not only will you all still turn a profit, but you're going to get more positive feedback from your consumers and from the people who are actually buying this drug from you.
And to kind of lessen the impact of that, we can promise the long-term growth.
Do you recommend, oh, is it time?
Pretty
No.
soon.
Sure, we have another minute.
Oh,
Please.
one last question. So would you recommend that we make this price change immediately or gradually? And with both scenarios, do you recommend that we have some way of communicating this?
Well, I think that we had discussed it being more of an immediate thing as opposed to gradually breaking it down, just to make that a bigger statement in the public eye and the consumer eye. Whether you all decide that that's to be done via press release or what have you, we believe that for this decrease in price to have the best and most effect for you all, it would be best to have it done in an immediate kind of repetition.
Okay, thank you.